When Curtis Mayfield passed away in 1999, his presence lingered in more ways than music. After his passing, the home he had lived in quietly changed hands a few times, and for years it seemed to sit in a kind of limbo, never staying with one family for long. The most recent buyers were a couple from Chicago, Daniel and Marissa Green, both in their mid-30s. They had grown tired of their cramped condo in the city and wanted more space for themselves and their young daughter, Layla. The Mayfield house, though old and in need of some repairs, carried an irresistible aura. It wasn't just a piece of property, it was a place tied to history, where the legendary soul musician had once lived and written. To Daniel, a lifelong fan of Mayfield's music, the thought of raising his family in the home of an icon felt like a dream. The house was modest compared to other celebrity estates, with brickwork weathered by decades of harsh Chicago winters, and a backyard that still held the remnants of an old recording shed. The couple bought it with little hesitation, and at first everything seemed normal, quiet even. They settled into the creaking rhythm of the house, repainting walls, fixing broken fixtures, and restoring some of its mid-century charm. But as the months passed, subtle disturbances began to trouble Marissa more than Daniel. She often heard music playing faintly from nowhere, in particular always the same fragments of Curtis's songs. The sounds never came from the stereo, or Layla's toys, or even passing cars outside. Instead, they seemed to hum from the walls themselves, low and soulful, as if someone was strumming invisible guitar strings within the house's frame. Layla, barely 6 years old, was the first to mention seeing someone. She told her parents about the man in the chair, who sat near the window in the den. At first, Daniel brushed it off as childhood imagination. But Marissa found it difficult to ignore when Layla described him in detail. A man with gentle eyes, wearing what she called old clothes, who didn't speak but seemed to be watching over her. Objects began to shift at odd hours, a record player needle dropping on its own, lights flickering only when certain songs played, framed photos sliding slightly out of alignment. One night, Marissa swore she heard footsteps moving slowly up the staircase, long after Daniel had gone to bed. She got up, checked the hall, and found nothing. But when she returned to the bedroom, Daniel was awake and pale. He had heard them too. The family never felt directly threatened, but the sense of being observed became constant. Friends who visited noticed the atmosphere as well. One even commented that the house felt too alive, as though every creak and shadow carried intention. Daniel, being a fan, wanted to believe it was Mayfield himself, his spirit still tied to the place he had cherished. But Marissa wasn't so sure. There was warmth, yes, but also a heaviness, as if the house bore witness to pain as much as music. After all, Curtis had endured tragedy in his later years, paralyzed from an accident on stage. Some rooms felt mournful, especially the den, where Layla continued to insist the man still sat quietly, watching. The Greens remain in the house for now, hesitant to leave but uneasy in their stay. Some nights they sleep peacefully, others they are kept awake by whispers of music no radio is playing. They never speak about selling it, as though the house won't let them go just yet. The Greens had been in the house for almost 6 months when the feeling of strangeness became impossible to ignore. It was never dramatic at first, never something that could be proven. It was subtler than that, as though the house itself had moods that shifted with the hours of the day. During daylight, the rooms seemed ordinary. Sunlight poured through the large front windows, warming the hardwood floors that still bore the scuffs of decades past. In those hours, Marissa could almost convince herself that the house was simply old, an aging structure with drafts and noises that could be explained away. Daniel worked from his home office upstairs, his music playing faintly through his headphones, while Layla colored at the kitchen table. But once night fell, the house seemed to breathe differently. The creaks in the wood were deeper, the shadows longer. The den in particular was difficult to stay in after dusk. It was a room they had intended to convert into a library, with shelves for Daniel's records and a small reading chair in the corner. But no matter how they arranged the space, it seemed to pull them into silence. Marissa would stand in the doorway sometimes, unwilling to step inside, her eyes drawn to that corner chair where Layla claimed the man appeared. What unnerved her most was the way Layla spoke about him without fear. Children usually exaggerated their imaginations, but Layla was matter of fact. She would say things like, "He's sitting there again, Mama. He doesn't want to scare us. He just listens." Other times she would mention his sadness, saying he looked heavy, as though his body carried weight it shouldn't. The nights grew heavier with sound. At first it was the faint chords, Curtis's own music, unmistakable, though incomplete, as if only pieces of a song were remembered by the walls themselves. The notes were warped, drifting in and out, almost like echoes from a neighbor's stereo, but never quite traceable to any source. Daniel, despite being a fan, found it difficult to accept. He kept telling himself it was just the house, just his mind trying to link coincidence with his admiration for Mayfield. But Marissa felt differently. The music unsettled her because it was always too close, like something whispered at her ear. It wasn't just the music. Objects in the house shifted when they shouldn't. Once, while Daniel was in his office, he heard the unmistakable scrape of the record player arm lowering onto vinyl. When he went downstairs, the record player in the den was spinning, the needle tracing grooves that weren't there on a record they hadn't even placed. Another night, Marissa set down her glass of water on the bedside table, only to find it missing minutes later, resting perfectly on the dresser across the room. She hadn't moved it. Neither had Daniel. The air itself sometimes carried a charge. Marissa would feel it first in her skin, goosebumps prickling without warning, the hair at the back of her neck rising as though static filled the room. Layla once complained that her blankets shook like someone touched them, though when Marissa checked, there was no draft, no movement at all. The den remained the heart of it. More than once, Daniel would catch the faintest whiff of cigarette smoke there, though neither he nor Marissa smoked. The chair in the corner, the one Layla always described, never stayed quite where they left it. It would be angled differently in the morning, pulled back from the wall just slightly, as if someone had sat there during the night. Marissa began to avoid that room altogether. She would pass by the doorway quickly, eyes averted, but sometimes, against her will, she would glance inside and feel a weight settle on her chest. It wasn't always threatening, but it was undeniable, like walking into a memory that wasn't her own. Daniel grew restless too, though he tried to hide it. The longer they stayed, the more he felt like he wasn't alone in his office upstairs. Some nights, while writing emails, he swore he heard footsteps in the hallway outside, slow and deliberate, stopping just before his door. When he opened it, there was nothing but the dark hallway stretching toward the den. And then there was Layla's latest description. She said the man in the chair had started to sing. She claimed she could hear him humming, his voice soft but filled with sadness. When Marissa asked what song, Layla shrugged and said, "I don't know. It's not a happy one. He just wants someone to hear it." The Greens tried not to speak of it in front of her, but in private their conversations grew tense. Daniel insisted the house was just old, that Layla was sensitive and picking up on their own anxieties. But Marissa knew better. There was intention behind these moments. The music, the movement of objects, the chair. None of it felt random. The house was holding something, or someone, and the longer they stayed, the clearer it became that whatever lingered there was beginning to notice them too. Don't forget to subscribe and like if you liked this story. The autumn months brought with them a chill that seemed to seep through every seam of the Mayfield house. The Greens had turned on the heat, sealed the windows, even added rugs to cover the floors, but the cold was never fully gone. It wasn't the ordinary kind of draft that came from poor insulation. This was a coldness that clung to the skin, as though the house carried with it the memory of some winter that had never ended. Marissa felt it most in the evenings, especially when she walked through the hallway that connected the den to the kitchen. The air would drop in temperature there so sharply that she found herself walking faster, her arms wrapped tightly around her body, avoiding even glancing toward the den's open doorway. Daniel, who tried harder than ever to maintain a sense of normalcy, spent more time in his upstairs office, but even he could not ignore the changes. His work was increasingly disrupted by small, persistent sounds. The tapping that came from the baseboards, too steady to be dismissed as settling wood. The faint vibration of strings, almost like the tuning of a guitar, drifting up from the floorboards beneath him. He thought, at first, that it must be his imagination, seated by his lifelong admiration for Curtis Mayfield's music. But the sounds persisted. Sometimes they grew louder at night, forcing him to remove his headphones just to confirm that the music was not coming from his computer. The record player became an object of suspicion. They had moved it from the den to the living room, thinking perhaps that leaving it in the place Layla called his room only invited more strangeness. But even in its new location, the machine behaved oddly. More than once, Marissa found it spinning with no record, the needle dragging across an empty turntable, producing a faint scratching sound that carried into the hallways. On one occasion, a record that had not been touched in years, a dusty copy of Superfly Daniel had bought long ago, was sitting neatly on the platter, though neither of them had placed it there. Daniel swore he had kept that record boxed in his office. The most unsettling changes were those that involved Layla. She had become quieter at home, less eager to play with her toys or watch cartoons. Instead, she lingered in the den, sitting on the rug near the corner chair, humming to herself. When Marissa asked her what she was doing, she said simply, "I'm listening." At first Marissa thought her daughter meant she was listening for the music, but when pressed, Layla explained that she was listening to the man. "He sings low like he's tired," she said. But he likes when I sit here, because he knows I'm not scared. Daniel dismissed it as a phase of childhood imagination, but the more Marissa observed, the more she noticed details that were too precise to ignore. Layla described the man's clothes and old jacket, the kind with wide lapels. She described how he leaned forward when he hummed, one hand resting on his knee, the other sometimes lifted as if strumming something invisible in the air. She even told her mother that the man sometimes looked sad when she left the room, as though her company had given him some measure of comfort. Marissa tried to rationalize it, but she began to feel something herself when she passed that corner chair. On several occasions she swore she caught a shape in her peripheral vision not distinct enough to make out a person, but dense enough to suggest a figure, darker than the shadows around it. Once, in the dim light of evening, she thought she saw the faintest shimmer, as though the air itself bent and folded above the chair. She blinked, and it was gone. But the heaviness remained, like the residue of someone who had just stood up and walked away. The house had grown louder. Doors that had once only creaked now rattled softly at night, as though brushed by unseen hands. The stairs groaned under invisible weight, and then there were the whispers never loud enough to be understood, but distinct enough to feel purposeful. Marissa heard them most when she was alone in the kitchen after dark, washing dishes, the water running while the faintest murmurs drifted from the hallway. She would stop, strain her ears, heart pounding, only to hear silence. Yet the moment she resumed her task, the low whispering would return. Daniel's skepticism began to falter the night he woke to the sound of a voice singing in their bedroom. It was not loud, not even clear, just a soft, mournful hum, the kind of melody that felt improvised, unbound by words. He sat up quickly, looking toward the doorway, and for the briefest second thought he saw someone standing there. The outline was faint, almost transparent, but there was no mistaking the shape of shoulders, a head bowed slightly forward, and the suggestion of movement like someone swaying with the rhythm of their own song. By the time he blinked, the doorway was empty. He didn't tell Marissa at first, but she knew something had shifted in him. The next morning at breakfast, when Layla spoke casually about the man in the chair humming again, Daniel didn't dismiss her words. He only stared into his coffee, silent. The Greens began speaking in hushed tones when Layla was asleep. They discussed whether the house was trying to tell them something, or whether it was their fault for disturbing a place that had belonged to someone who had carried so much through his life. Daniel, for all his skepticism, admitted that he had started to feel watched in every room. Marissa confessed that she often woke at night to the sound of breathing that wasn't Daniel's. Neither wanted to admit it aloud, but the truth was impossible to ignore. The haunting was no longer subtle. It was no longer bound to the den. Whatever lingered in Curtis Mayfield's old house was beginning to move freely, and it was making itself known more and more with each passing night. Winter settled heavily on the city, and with it, the house seemed to darken. The days were short, the nights long, and the Greens found themselves more confined indoors than they liked. The house, once a place of excitement and promise, now felt like a weight pressing down on all three of them. The den had become the center of the haunting, but by now, the presence had spread throughout the home. No corner felt untouched. The footsteps on the stairs came nightly, deliberate, slow, and always stopping just outside the bedroom door. Sometimes the door itself would shift as though pressed by a hand, the faint creak of the hinges pulling Daniel awake in a cold sweat. He began sleeping lightly, waking at every sound, but the sounds never ceased. Layla had grown even closer to the figure in the den. What disturbed Marissa most was not her daughter's fear, it was her lack of it. Layla no longer referred to him simply as the man in the chair. She began calling him Curtis, though Marissa and Daniel had never told her his name. They had been careful not to speak it aloud when discussing the haunting. But one evening at dinner, Layla had simply announced, "Curtis says the chair is his." When Marissa pressed her, Layla explained matter-of-factly that he had told her, not with words, but with something like thoughts that came into her head. Daniel tried to mask his unease, but his denial was gone. He admitted privately to Marissa that he too had seen the outline of a man, not once but several times, always at night, always in motion as if walking from one room to another, or leaning in the doorway just long enough for the eye to catch. He confessed that he had even heard his own records play in the middle of the night, ones he hadn't touched in months, the stylus dragging across grooves with impossible precision. The songs that played were never full, always fragments, as though the house only remembered pieces of them. The turning point came one particularly cold night in January. Marissa had gone downstairs to fetch a blanket. The house was still, and the only sound was the wind pushing against the old windows. She passed the den, and for the first time, she felt compelled to look inside rather than avoid it. The sight froze her in place. The chair was occupied, not by a full figure, nothing so solid, but by a density, a heaviness in the air that shaped itself unmistakably into the outline of a man. Shoulders hunched, head bowed, one hand resting on his knee. A faint glow seemed to cling to him, not bright, but enough to distinguish him from the darkness of the room. And then she heard it. A soft, broken hum, the rhythm uneven, as if the singer were tired, his breath catching between notes. Marissa could not move. She stood in the doorway, staring, tears stinging her eyes without her knowing why. The sound carried with it something that felt less like fear and more like sorrow. A sorrow so deep it made her chest ache. The figure did not look at her, did not acknowledge her presence. He only hummed, swaying slightly, as though he were trapped in some endless performance that no audience could ever fully hear. She fled the room, clutching the blanket, and locked the bedroom door behind her. When she told Daniel, he didn't argue. He only nodded grimly, saying, "I've seen him too." From that night on, the haunting escalated. Lights flickered more violently, doors slammed without warning, and the cold spread even when the heat was high. Layla spoke often of Curtis sitting with her, sometimes telling her not to be afraid, sometimes just humming to fill the silence. She seemed more tired, her eyes shadowed, as though the weight of his company was draining her in ways she couldn't understand. Daniel finally began researching the house's history in earnest, digging through records, speaking to locals. He learned that Mayfield had spent his final years in this home, writing, struggling, confined after his accident. The den, according to neighbors, had been his favorite room, the place where he would sit for hours, sometimes alone, sometimes surrounded by friends, sometimes lost in thought. The chair, Daniel realized, was not just furniture, it was the center of a life, and perhaps the anchor of whatever remained. The realization brought no relief. Instead, the presence grew bolder. On more than one night, Daniel and Marissa woke to the sound of their daughter's voice speaking softly in the darkness. When they entered her room, they found her sitting upright in bed, eyes half closed, as though listening to someone just beyond their hearing. When asked what she was doing, she replied, "Curtis is singing me back to sleep." The breaking point came in the early hours of a February morning. A crash echoed through the house, shaking the walls. Daniel ran downstairs to find the den in disarray. The chair, always slightly moved, was now dragged violently into the center of the room. The record player was on the floor, its needle scratching furiously. And in the corner, for just a moment, Daniel saw him clearer than ever before. A man, tall, weary, his eyes fixed on Daniel with something between grief and warning. Then he was gone. That was when Daniel and Marissa decided they could not stay. They packed quickly, keeping the explanation vague for Layla, though she seemed to understand without question. On their last night in the house, as they prepared to leave for good, Marissa stood once more in the hallway, looking toward the den. The chair was back in its place, angled toward the window. For a moment, she thought she heard the faintest hum, low, broken, and full of longing. They left before dawn, never looking back. The house still stands, quiet on the outside, but neighbors say they sometimes hear music drifting faintly from within, long after the windows have gone dark. The chair remains in the den, untouched, as though waiting for someone to sit down again. And those who have been inside since swear the air is never still. It hums with memory, heavy with a presence that refuses to be forgotten. Don't forget to subscribe and like if you liked this story.